The silence in the Hayes mansion, 8 weeks after Arthur's funeral, was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and tinged with the scent of old leather and unspent grief. Eleanor Ellie Hayes, 72, sat in the vast, echoing library, the sun weak against the towering, sealed windows. She was a woman built for comfort and kindness, whose primary function in life had been to manage the emotional climate for her late husband, Arthur. Now, the climate was freezing. Arthur, a man of ruthless efficiency and immense professional success in logistics and international transport, had managed everything: the investments, the properties, the taxes, and even the social calendar. Ellie had been a loving, capable wife, but she had never held a deed, paid a bill above the household maintenance, or looked at a brokerage statement. Her financial world was a hazy, comforting abstraction, handled entirely by a man she had trusted implicitly. Her wound was not just Arthur's death, but the profound, paralyzing dependency he had fostered over 50 years. If you're still here, welcome to Voice of Jenna, a place where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Here, we dive into real emotions, family drama, quiet heartbreaks, unexpected twists, and the moments that change us. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you what happened next. The reading of the will was scheduled for that afternoon. Ellie was nervous, but she assumed the obvious. Half the estate, which everyone estimated at over $30 million, would revert to her as the surviving spouse, and the remainder would be split between their 2 adult children. Her children, however, held no such sentiment. Julian, 45, was a high-powered corporate lawyer, sharp-edged and analytical. Caroline, 42, was a successful branding consultant, polished and entitled. They had descended upon the house the day after the funeral, not to comfort their mother, but to inventory their future. They moved through the mansion like property inspectors, cataloging the art, debating the market value of the East Coast properties, and scrutinizing the financial ledgers Arthur had maintained in his mahogany-paneled office. "We need to ensure Mother is comfortable, of course," Julian had remarked to Caroline over a vintage Bordeaux one evening, the compassion in his tone thinner than the wine glass. "But we must be realistic. She's 72. She doesn't need liquidity. She needs care. And Arthur's businesses need immediate capital injection to survive this market shift. We can't have her estate tied up in some restrictive trust." Caroline, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her tablet, had nodded, her eyes already calculating the cost of a new Manhattan penthouse. "Exactly. We need to be proactive. If Arthur didn't plan for this, we must. Mother is too kind. She'd give it all away to some stray cat charity." The clear implication was that Ellie, retired from any active role and emotionally fragile, was simply an obstacle to the immediate monetization of the family fortune. They were successful in their own right, but $30 million was the difference between comfortable success and intergenerational wealth supremacy. They viewed the estate as their birthright and their mother as a sentimental liability. As the family solicitor, Mr. Davies, arrived, the atmosphere in the library grew glacial. Julian and Caroline sat opposite Ellie, impeccably dressed, their expressions a carefully calibrated mix of solemnity and impatience. Ellie, wearing a simple cardigan, looked small and fragile in the immense room. Mr. Davies, a man worn down by the Hayes family's complexities, cleared his throat and began the formal reading. He detailed Arthur's impressive list of assets: the international shipping shares, the commercial real estate portfolio, the liquidity held in Swiss accounts, and the physical properties. The total valuation was indeed slightly over $30 million. The document then outlined the distribution. Julian was bequeathed the majority stake in Arthur's logistics firm, valued at $12 million, plus the Miami penthouse. Caroline received the controlling shares in the property management division, valued at $10 million, plus the Martha's Vineyard estate. They were the executors, the successors, the undisputed heirs to the Hayes dynasty. Ellie braced herself, expecting the joint ownership of the mansion and a substantial cash bequest. Mr. Davies continued, his voice softer, slightly hesitant, as he reached the section detailing Eleanor's inheritance. "To my dearest wife, Eleanor, For her love and support over 5 decades, I leave the following provision. Eleanor will retain the legal ownership of the primary residence, the family mansion, free of mortgage and encumbrance. Additionally, she is granted a lifetime annuity generating $80,000 per year to ensure her comfort and maintenance in perpetuity. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the library. $80,000 per year. A minuscule fraction of the estate, barely enough to cover the mansion's property taxes, staff salaries, and insurance, let alone her personal expenses. It was not a generous provision. It was a salary for a caretaker, a stipend for a resident ornamental figurehead. Julian shifted, a flash of thinly veiled triumph in his eyes. Caroline offered a quick, practiced, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. They had won. They had the capital, the businesses, and the liquidity. Their mother had the house, and a liquid, expensive burden to maintain. Ellie's world tilted. The profound realization of her utter financial powerlessness, the cold clarity that Arthur had viewed her not as a partner, but as a long-term liability, crashed down on her. The grief over her husband was instantly eclipsed by the sharp, terrifying panic of her financial vulnerability, a wound deeper than his death. Mr. Davies closed the ledger. Finally, there is one last non-financial bequest. Mr. Hayes instructed that this item be delivered to Mrs. Hayes, and only to Mrs. Hayes, upon the conclusion of the reading. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, roughly 12-inch manila envelope. It was not pristine or legal grade. It was faded, slightly warped, and bore the faint scent of mildew, sealed with a piece of old, brittle wax. It looked utterly insignificant next to the $30 million in global assets. This envelope, Mr. Davies said, placing the dusty, anonymous package into Eleanor's trembling hands, was found taped to the underside of the bottom drawer in Mr. Hayes's private study desk. It is addressed simply, for Ellie when the time comes. Ellie stared at the cheap, forgotten envelope. Julian and Caroline exchanged a contemptuous glance, some worthless sentimental trinket, undoubtedly. Ellie, holding the dusty paper, felt a sudden, inexplicable shift. The terror subsided, replaced by a spark of pure, fierce curiosity. The contents of that ordinary, mysterious envelope were the only thing Arthur had truly kept secret from everyone. What her children thought was a useless relic was, in that moment, the only valuable thing she possessed. The moment Mr. Davies departed, leaving the oppressive weight of the legal transfer behind, the atmosphere in the library shifted from solemnity to calculated aggression. Julian and Caroline stood, their posture radiating ownership and immediate intent. "Mother, darling, that annuity will, of course, cover your personal needs," Caroline began, her voice falsely sweet. "But the maintenance on this house is catastrophic. We need to begin immediately dissolving the household staff and switching the utilities into your name. The estate accounts cannot cover personal living expenses anymore." Julian, the lawyer, was more direct. "The executor accounts are now exclusively under our control, per the will. That annuity is paid monthly. You'll need to set up a new checking account in your name. We'll handle the staff severance packages, but the payroll stops tonight." Ellie felt the immediate, brutal impact of their maneuver. They were not just taking the $30 million, they were cutting her off from the life support of the mansion itself, forcing her to realize the true cost of her new, meager income. They had instantly made her the caretaker of a vast, illiquid liability. She simply nodded, clutching the dusty, ancient envelope Arthur had left her. Its rough paper felt grounding, the only thing in the room that hadn't betrayed her. "I understand. I need to be alone now." Dismissed and dismissed, Ellie retreated, not to her sprawling master suite, but to Arthur's private study, the room that was now Julian's inheritance. She locked the heavy door, shutting out the sound of her children already making calls to realtors and property managers. Arthur's study was a sanctuary of his competence, filled with complex, antique maps, leather-bound ledgers, and the scent of expensive pipe tobacco, long since extinguished. She sat in his worn, magnificent chair, the dusty envelope resting on the cleared expanse of the mahogany desk. She examined the envelope again. It was a cheap, standard manila, but the wax seal was unique, an ornate crest she vaguely recognized but couldn't place, unlike the Hayes family seal. It suggested a secret history, a private association Arthur had kept separate from his corporate life. With trembling fingers, Ellie carefully broke the brittle wax seal. Inside, there were two objects, neither of which was a financial instrument. The first was a small, antique key. It was not a modern security key but a delicate, wrought iron key, the kind that might unlock a cabinet, a strongbox, or a very old door. It was cold and heavy in her palm. The second item was a single sheet of aged, linen paper, folded into quarters. On it, written in Arthur's precise, characteristic script, was a cryptic message. My dearest Ellie, I saw this coming. I trust you, but not their greed. They take the surface, you take the depth. Find the place where the maps overlap and the time stands still. Look for the third name, the one they never knew. The key fits the lock of the silent witness. Only the archivist knows the path. Use the name, then find the book of entries. With eternal love, Arthur. Ellie read the note 3 times, her breath catching in her throat. It was a puzzle, a final, intricate game orchestrated by her meticulous, secretive husband. Arthur hadn't been indifferent. He had anticipated his children's avarice and had planned an elaborate, final act of protection. The $80,000 annuity wasn't his final word. It was a smokescreen. The note confirmed the depth of Julian and Caroline's betrayal. Arthur had known they would prioritize the liquid capital and dismiss anything that looked sentimental or useless, like an old key and a piece of dusty paper. They took the surface, the financial figures visible in the public ledger, and Arthur had intended for her to find the depth. The third name, the silent witness, the archivist. Ellie murmured, testing the words. They were not corporate terms. They sounded literary, historical, or perhaps even Masonic. It was completely outside her domestic sphere of knowledge. Before she could delve deeper into the mystery, the door handle rattled furiously. Mother, open the door. Julian's voice was sharp, impatient, his legal composure fraying already. The maintenance accounts are showing an outstanding payment for the utility service. I've frozen the joint accounts, and I need you to sign a form redirecting the automated payments to the annuity account. Ellie silently slipped the note and the key into the small pocket of her cardigan. She opened the door, facing her son. I need access to the primary financial files, Mother. I can't have your personal expenses jeopardizing the estate's liquidity, Julian said, his eyes scanning the desk, looking for any stray bank statements she might have missed. I haven't even had time to grieve, Julian. I'll open a new account next week, Ellie replied, her voice calm, a shield of maternal fatigue protecting the sharp glint of realization in her eyes. Next week isn't good enough, he snapped, abandoning the pretense of politeness. I'm cutting off the access cards tonight. We need control of the capital. You will have to wait for the first annuity payment in 30 days. 30 days? Ellie asked, the implication clear. She was immediately cash poor, unable to buy groceries or pay the remaining staff without his approval. It's standard protocol, Mother. The estate needs to be protected, Julian confirmed, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He was ensuring she was trapped in the house, financially neutered, dependent entirely on his schedule and the trickle of her annuity. As Julian took control of Arthur's study, Ellie walked away, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a growing, cold fury. The $30 million was gone, and she was now living in a magnificent cage. But she had something her children didn't know about: the key, the cryptic note, and the silent, profound admission from her husband that he had expected this betrayal. She knew what she had to do first. She needed to understand the world Arthur inhabited outside of their marriage, the world of silent witnesses and archivist knowledge. She needed to find that third name. Ellie settled in her small, personal sitting room, pulling out her laptop. Arthur's life had been focused on international shipping, logistics, and capital management. She started the only way she knew how, searching his company's public records, looking for anything that might link the words maps, archivist, or book of entries to a project, a partnership, or a nonprofit foundation. The pursuit of the clue was no longer a game. It was her only path to survival, autonomy, and justice. Ellie sat hunched over Arthur's desk, the mahogany surface cool beneath her elbows, the scent of dust and old ambitions thick in the air. The manila envelope lay discarded. The small, wrought iron key and Arthur's cryptic message were all that mattered. She ignored the muffled sounds of Julian and Caroline downstairs, already making calls to appraisers. They were seizing control of the present. She was trying to unlock the past. The message's language was completely foreign to her life as Mrs. Arthur Hayes, socialite and homemaker. The third name, the silent witness, the archivist. It confirmed her sudden, terrifying realization. Her husband had lived a complex, compartmentalized life, and she had only ever been privy to the domestic facade. Arthur, the meticulous man who organized global supply chains, had died, leaving her a treasure hunt, not a treasury. She began by focusing on the wax seal's crest, which she had peeled carefully from the envelope. It depicted a highly stylized, antique astrolabe intertwined with an anchor. It was the antithesis of Arthur's corporate logo, no aggressive vectors or modern typography, just a deep, historical elegance. She pulled out her iPad, her access to the vast digital world Arthur rarely relied on, and searched for the symbols. Astrolabe and Anchor Historical Society. The search was slow, interrupted by a sharp knock on the study door. "Mother, it's Julian. I need the combination to the main safe. We are preparing the liquidity transfer for the Swiss accounts." "I don't know it, Julian," Ellie replied, her voice firm. "Arthur handled those details entirely. I never once accessed the safe." A beat of silence, then Julian's frustrated huff. "Fine. We'll call a locksmith. Don't touch anything in this room, Mother. It's part of the estate and must be inventoried." The interruption reinforced her urgency. She was under surveillance. She returned to her search, focusing the results geographically on the East Coast and adding keywords like private library and historical society. Finally, a result materialized: the Harrington Society for Cartography and Maritime History. She clicked the link and a small, antique logo filled the screen. The astrolabe and the anchor, identical to the crest on the wax. The third name. Arthur hadn't named a person or a company. He had named a hidden passion, a secretive organization dedicated to the study of ancient navigation and maps. The note suddenly clicked into focus. Find the place where the maps overlap and the time stands still. The Harrington Society, a cartography archive. The key fits the lock of the silent witness. The Society's collection must hold a private, locked space. Only the archivist knows the path. Use the name, then find the book of entries. She needed a contact, and she needed a specific record. Ellie's heart began to race, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of independent discovery. She realized the key must be an old storage key for the Society. She quickly navigated the Society's website. It was sparse, focused on preservation efforts and obscure research. Under the staff section, she found the name, Dr. Elias Thorne, head archivist. The archivist. Before making contact, she had to ensure she had her cover story ready. She couldn't reveal the contents of the note or the depth of the deception. She called the Society's main line. A moment of hesitation, then she adopted a voice that was calm, yet slightly distracted. The perfect persona of a grieving, slightly clueless widow managing her late husband's affairs. Dr. Thorne answered himself. His voice was low, scholarly, and immediately kind. "Harrington Society," he said. "Dr. Thorne, my name is Eleanor Hayes. I am the widow of Arthur Hayes," she began. "My husband was deeply involved with the Society, I believe. We're in the process of settling his estate, and I found a small key and a cryptic note among his things. It refers to a silent witness and a book of entries. Do these terms mean anything to you?" A silence stretched across the line, longer than a mere pause. It was a calculating silence, the sound of a scholar processing highly specific data. "Mrs. Hayes," Dr. Thorne finally replied, his voice dropping an octave. I have been the archivist here for 30 years. He was our most profound benefactor and a dedicated research fellow. I did not know his full name until his public obituary, as he insisted on using an alias here. He went by Mr. A. Finch. A. Finch, a bird's name, signifying flight and freedom, completely separate from the heavy weight of Hayes logistics. Arthur's foresight was staggering. Mr. Finch often spoke of a silent witness, yes. He was referring to his private, locked repository here, a small cabinet in the deep archives where he kept documents related to his longest-running historical obsession, the financial movements of the early 20th century shipping cartels. He was preparing a monograph. And the key? Ellie asked, her breath held tight. The wrought iron key, yes. It opens only that cabinet, which is sealed. He instructed me, explicitly, that should he pass away, only the trustee of his personal affairs, or his wife, could ever access it. He called it the final entry point. Ellie felt a shiver of profound excitement and terror. This was not about history. It was about Arthur's finances, hidden in plain sight under the guise of an obscure scholarly project. He also mentioned a book of entries. Ellie probed. That would be the cabinet's internal ledger, Dr. Thorne confirmed. Arthur kept meticulous, handwritten records of everything he placed in there, logged sequentially, rather than chronologically. It's a literal book of entries. Ellie now understood the entirety of the riddle. Arthur had created a completely separate, physically remote, and non-corporate repository for his most crucial secrets, insulated by the respectability of an obscure archive. Julian and Caroline would never look here. They were focused on the digital accounts and the legal ledgers. They would never imagine their hard-nosed business father had hidden his most sensitive files in a dusty cabinet under a pseudonym. Dr. Thorne, Ellie said, her voice now completely steady. I need to come to the Harrington Society immediately. I need to access that cabinet. I will arrange a private viewing for tomorrow morning, Mrs. Hayes. I assure you, absolute discretion is paramount here. Ellie hung up, her hands still clutching the antique key. Her heart was beating a triumphant rhythm. Arthur hadn't abandoned her. He had given her a roadmap to freedom and a weapon against their children's greed. A final, urgent knock rattled the door. It was Julian, his temper frayed. Mother, the locksmith is here. I need you out of the study now. We are accessing the safe. Ellie stood up, the small key warm in her pocket. She opened the door, a serene smile on her face. Of course, dear. Be careful with Arthur's things. He was very particular. She watched Julian and the locksmith proceed with their brute force approach to the safe. They were focused on the large, public repository of corporate wealth. They were drilling through steel for the $30 million they already owned. Ellie knew that tomorrow, she would simply walk through a quiet door, insert an antique key, and access the one thing that truly mattered, the depth of Arthur's planning and the truth that lay hidden in his book of entries. The Harrington Society for Cartography and Maritime History was housed in a grand, forgotten stone building tucked away on a cobblestone side street near the port. It was a world away from the aggressive glass towers where Julian and Caroline brokered their deals. The air inside smelled of dust, parchment, and polished brass, a sanctuary where the weight of time was measured in centuries, not stock ticks. Ellie arrived the next morning, feeling a nervous energy she hadn't known in decades. She wore a simple charcoal suit, a practical choice that felt like an armor of anonymity. She no longer looked like the grieving widow. She looked like a client on a highly confidential mission. She was greeted by Dr. Elias Thorne, the head archivist, a slender man in his 60s with kind eyes and the precise, quiet movements of someone accustomed to handling priceless, fragile objects. Mrs. Hayes, thank you for coming, Dr. Thorne said, leading her through a maze of quiet reading rooms. Arthur, Mr. Finch, was one of the few people who understood the true value of discretion. He always appreciated things that were hidden in plain sight. Dr. Thorne confirmed that Arthur's alias, Mr. A. Finch, had been known to only 3 people at the Society. Arthur had used the Society's nonprofit status and their deep, high-security vault, designed to protect irreplaceable historical documents, as a perfect, impenetrable blind spot. Julian and Caroline, focused on corporate firewalls and digital security, would never think to look in a place devoted to 17th-century shipping logs. He was preparing what he called a monograph on the flow of capital and maritime secrecy. Dr. Thorne explained as they descended into the archives, a vast, temperature-controlled subterranean vault. But I always suspected the project was far more personal than historical. He led her to a secluded corner of the vault, past rows of ancient, leather-bound atlases. Against the far wall sat a massive, beautifully carved wooden cabinet, the silent witness. It was made of dark, heavy oak, sealed with a brass plate that read, A.F. Private Repository, 1995. "This is it," Dr. Thorne whispered. "The key fits here." Ellie pulled the antique, wrought-iron key from her pocket. Her hands were steadier now. This key wasn't to a house or a car. It was the key to her autonomy. With a sharp click and a deep, resonant groan, the cabinet unlocked. Inside, there was no parchment or ancient maps. The upper shelf held a small collection of first-edition classics, Shakespeare, Austen, Dickens, the sentimental favorites of a man who rarely showed emotion. But the bottom shelf contained the objects Arthur had referred to in his note. The first was a large, ledger-style book, bound in plain, deep green leather. This was the Book of Entries. Beside it sat a heavy, fireproof document box, sealed with a modern, high-security padlock. "I will leave you now, Mrs. Hayes," Dr. Thorne said, nodding respectfully. Arthur often said that the greatest secrets are always kept in the most obvious places. "You may have absolute privacy here." Ellie thanked him and, once alone, reached for the Book of Entries. She opened it to the first page. It was filled, not with historical notes, but with Arthur's immaculate, handwritten financial records spanning the last 25 years. This was his private, off-the-books ledger. She flipped through pages detailing offshore holding companies and international commodity trades, names of firms she didn't recognize, all meticulously labeled with a cryptic tracking code, Project Nightingale. Finally, she reached the final entry, dated 3 days before Arthur's fatal heart attack. Entry number 119, the final transfer. Executed 10/24/20XX. Asset: Commercial Real Estate Parcel 49B, Manhattan West Side, the Hudson Towers land. Valuation: Current market appraisal, $42 million. Action: Title deed physically transferred and legally registered to the Nightingale Preservation Trust, Cayman Islands, EST 1995. Condition of transfer: irrevocable until dissolution of the Hayes family trust, the will. Upon reading of the will, the trusteeship of Nightingale defaults to the sole remaining beneficiary unnamed in the primary testamentary division, i.e., Eleanor Hayes. Key requirement: physical control of the deed of irrevocability, contained in the sealed box. This deed, once recorded locally by the new trustee, legally supersedes all primary testamentary divisions regarding this specific asset. The children were given the liquidity. Ellie gets the capital, a liquid land, plus the authority to sell. Ellie felt a dizzying surge of pure adrenaline. $42 million. Not in cash or shares, which Julian and Caroline could immediately seize and spend, but in a prime piece of real estate, completely separate from the estate that had just been divided. Arthur hadn't just protected her, he had given her the ultimate weapon, concealing his single most valuable, non-corporate asset within a labyrinthine legal structure that the corporate lawyers, Julian and Caroline, were too arrogant to search for. They had focused entirely on the easy money, the surface, and missed the depth. The condition was the genius of his plan. Arthur knew his children would ensure they were the only named beneficiaries of the primary testamentary division, the $30 million split. That very action, their greed, triggered the default clause in the Nightingale Preservation Trust, making Ellie the sole remaining beneficiary unnamed in the primary testamentary division. Her small annuity was the perfect smokescreen, disguising her as a non-player. Now, she needed the deed of irrevocability to assert her claim. The note had led her to the key, and the key had led her to the Book of Entries. Now, the book pointed to the sealed box. Ellie turned to the heavy fireproof box. It was secured by a modern, high-grade combination lock, far too complex for her to pick. She flipped back through the book of entries, searching for the combination. On the last page, in a small, faint footnote, Arthur had written a small equation. Lock code: the year we met divided by the number of children they wanted. Ellie smiled, a genuine, warm, and profoundly strategic smile. Arthur was still talking to her. The year they met was 1974. They had always wanted 4 children, but only had 2. The lock combination was simple: 1-9-7-4/4. It was a reminder that this treasure was secured by the intimacy of their marriage, not the ruthlessness of his business. She carefully entered the numbers. The lock clicked open. Inside, resting on a bed of archival tissue, was the original deed of irrevocability for the $42 million Manhattan property. It was pristine, executed by an entirely separate, foreign legal team, and waiting for the signature of the new trustee, Eleanor Hayes. Ellie placed the deed into her suit jacket. She had gone from being a penniless widow with an $80,000 annuity to the sole legal owner of a $42 million asset, completely outside the reach of her entitled children. Julian and Caroline had taken the $30 million. Ellie, the irrelevant one, had just found the real prize and the weapon to fight back. The time for silent grief was over. The time for the strategist's work was about to begin. The weight of the deed of irrevocability in Ellie's briefcase was a physical manifestation of her new power. Leaving the quiet sanctity of the Harrington Society, she felt the stark contrast between the world of ancient maps and the brutal reality of modern corporate greed. She was holding a $42 million secret, an asset that completely superseded the $30 million her children had so eagerly seized. The first step was absolute discretion. She knew she couldn't use Mr. Davies, the family solicitor, who was now entirely compliant with Julian's executive demands. She needed a legal eagle, someone outside the Hayes orbit, whose loyalty was entirely transactional. She thought of Arthur's cryptic note: "I trust you, but not their greed." The only person Ellie knew in Arthur's professional network who was fiercely independent and had once expressed genuine respect for Ellie herself was Miriam Kahn, a notoriously sharp real estate and trust litigation attorney who had handled one of Arthur's hostile takeovers years ago. Miriam was known to have a frosty relationship with Julian, who had once tried to poach her for his own firm and failed. Ellie called Miriam from a public phone booth, a relic of the past that offered privacy Julian couldn't track. She kept the conversation brief, her voice low and direct. "Miriam, my name is Eleanor Hayes. I need an urgent, confidential consultation regarding a complex, non-testamentary real estate transfer. The asset is located on the west side, and the paperwork involves a trust established in 1995. Miriam's response was immediate and professional, lacking any surprise. "Mrs. Hayes, Arthur always spoke highly of you. I've read the probate filing. I assume this is separate. You know my rates are non-negotiable. My capital is now entirely independent of the Hayes estate, Miriam. I believe the asset in question is valued at $42 million. I need you to assert the Nightingale Preservation Trust and record the deed of irrevocability immediately." The number silenced Miriam. A $42 million asset completely outside the Hayes estate was precisely the kind of high-stakes, secretive work she thrived on. They agreed to meet at Miriam's private office the following morning. Returning to the mansion, Ellie found the atmosphere thick with Julian and Caroline's impatience. They had managed to crack Arthur's safe, but had only found corporate financial data and the keys to the Swiss accounts, all of which now belonged to them, per the will. They were frustrated by the slow pace of liquidating Arthur's businesses and were now turning their attention to the last remaining loose end: their mother. "Mother, we need to finalize your living arrangements," Julian announced, meeting her in the hallway. He held a spreadsheet detailing the mansion's quarterly expenses. "This property costs over $25,000 a month to run. Your annuity is $6,666 monthly. The numbers don't work. We need to transition you to a comfortable, fully staffed community. I've already researched options in Boca Raton. Caroline, leaning against a pillar, added with chilling coldness, "It's about security, Mother. You can't manage this house alone. It will become a burden and, frankly, a liability to the estate's residual value." Ellie stood before them, gripping her briefcase. They were trying to force her out, convinced that the mansion, the symbol of her inheritance, was simply too expensive for her meager allowance. They viewed her as a defenseless occupant who needed to be safely shelved. She decided to deploy the first piece of Arthur's wisdom: distraction. She needed to send them chasing the money they thought they had lost, ensuring their focus remained far from obscure cartography societies and private offshore trusts. "Before we discuss Boca Raton, Julian," Ellie said calmly, maintaining eye contact, "I found a handwritten note from your father regarding the liquidation of the Swiss accounts." Julian instantly went rigid. "What note?" "We found no notes regarding the Swiss accounts." "Arthur was meticulous," Ellie continued, pulling a blank piece of stationery from her pocket, pretending to consult it. "He wrote that a large portion of the capital he held in Zurich, specifically $8 million, was recently liquidated and used to acquire shares in a company he called Phoenix Maritime Holdings. He noted the acquisition was high-risk, unlisted, and completed 3 months ago to avoid a pending capital gains tax." This was a calculated, brilliant lie. Phoenix Maritime Holdings was the name of a defunct, obscure company Arthur had mentioned once at dinner, dismissing it as a failed project. But the $8 million figure was just enough to cause alarm. Julian's face went white with fury and disbelief. $8 million? Unlisted shares? Why would he risk that kind of capital? That wasn't in the corporate ledgers. It was a personal venture, Ellie said simply, channeling the detached confidence Arthur himself used when dismissing corporate anxiety. "He said you should look for the paper trail starting in Liechtenstein, not Zurich. He used the alias A. Finch for the transfer." The use of the alias, borrowed from the archivist conversation, was pure genius. It was a verifiable truth. Arthur used a secret alias, applied to a financial fiction, the $8 million purchase. Julian, the corporate lawyer, instantly discounted the sentimental old woman and focused entirely on the massive, unexpected financial hole. "Liechtenstein? A. Finch." Julian sputtered, pulling out his phone instantly. "We need to get the lawyers on this immediately. If he locked up $8 million in some unlisted, private venture, it changes the entire liquidity assessment." Caroline lost her composure completely. $8 million? "Julian, that affects the property management shares. We need to stop the portfolio diversification until we locate this." The mention of the high-risk, hidden investment had successfully diverted all their attention and paranoia back to the $30 million pot they had already divided. The specter of a secret, lost asset, an investment that could be hemorrhaging money, was far more compelling to them than the possibility that Ellie, the irrelevant mother, had found a hidden gain. They completely forgot about the Boca Raton retirement home. Ellie watched them scramble, their partnership already fraying under the sudden pressure of financial uncertainty. They were now fighting the ghost of Arthur's alleged bad judgment, while Ellie walked away with the undeniable proof of his strategic genius. That evening, Ellie prepared for her meeting with Miriam Khan. She packed the deed, the key, and the book of entries, the only pieces of evidence linking her to the $42 million Nightingale Preservation Trust. She knew that by tomorrow afternoon, the deed would be recorded, the trust would be asserted, and the legal fiction of her poverty would be over. Julian and Caroline would discover that while they were chasing a non-existent $8 million loss in Liechtenstein, Ellie had quietly secured a $42 million gain in Manhattan, completely invalidating their assumptions about their inheritance and their mother's competency. The moment of truth was almost at hand. The meeting at Miriam Khan's office felt like the calm before a financial tsunami. Miriam was utterly professional, her demeanor suggesting she routinely dealt with estates of this complexity, even ones involving cryptic notes and secret offshore trusts hidden in historical archives. She reviewed the deed of irrevocability, the trust documents, and Arthur's handwritten book of entries, her eyes widening only slightly at the brilliance of Arthur's conditional transfer clause. "Your husband was a genius, Mrs. Hayes," Miriam stated, folding the deed neatly. He anticipated their greed perfectly. By ensuring Julian and Caroline were named the exclusive, liquid beneficiaries in the main will, he legally triggered the Nightingale Preservation Trust's default clause, making you the sole remaining beneficiary unnamed in the primary testamentary division. It's bulletproof. The very thing they rushed to acquire, the $30 million, was the mechanism that legally barred them from the $42 million capital asset. What is the next step? Ellie asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Execution, Miriam replied, smiling coldly. The deed and the assertion of the trust must be recorded publicly in the New York Registry today. Once that's done, the property is irrevocably yours. Julian and Caroline, as executors of the Hayes estate, will learn about it the hard way, when the title insurance agency alerts them to the massive, unexpected change in ownership of a key family asset that they thought was still tied up in probate complications. Miriam and her team moved with merciless efficiency. By late afternoon, the deed was filed and the $42 million Manhattan property was legally recorded under the sole governance of the Nightingale Preservation Trust, with Eleanor Hayes as the undisputed trustee. Ellie Hayes was no longer defined by an $80,000 annuity. She was a major commercial real estate owner and the principal of a private foundation. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the wheels were coming off Julian and Caroline's partnership. They had spent 2 days in a fruitless, frantic attempt to trace the non-existent $8 million Phoenix Maritime Holdings investment. Julian's high-powered legal team confirmed the truth. There was no purchase, no transfer to Liechtenstein, and no paper trail under the alias A. Finch linked to Arthur's known corporate dealings. The $8 million scare was a financial phantom. She lied. Julian spat, slamming his laptop shut in Arthur's study. She made it up. There is no Phoenix Maritime. She gave us a completely fabricated lead to waste our time while she sits here, defenseless, clinging to this damned, expensive house. Caroline was equally furious.
Why?
Why would she invent a loss? To frighten us? It makes no sense. Unless, she trailed off, her gaze darting around the room, suspicion slowly hardening into conviction. Unless she was distracting us from something else. Something we missed in the public filings. Julian's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on managing the public $30 million that he had ignored the private sphere. He looked at the bottom drawer of Arthur's desk, the one they had scoured for bank statements and corporate keys, never realizing the dusty envelope had been taped beneath it.
We missed something.
Mother didn't suddenly grow a sense of humor.
She was told to look for something.
She was tipped off. They descended the grand staircase to find Ellie sitting serenely in the drawing room, reading a historical biography, looking exactly like the irrelevant widow they believed her to be. They approached her together, their voices tight with controlled rage. "Mother," Julian began, his lawyer-speak abandoned for raw accusation. "We have traced the Phoenix Maritime Holdings lead. It is a fabrication. There is no $8 million loss. We want to know why you deliberately lied to the executors of the estate." Ellie set her book down gently. She looked at her children, seeing not her successful, self-assured offspring, but two greedy, panicked figures trapped by the limits of their own assumptions. "I didn't lie, Julian," Ellie said, her voice steady and clear. "I simply repeated what I found in a note left by your father. The note was hidden in a dusty envelope, taped beneath the desk drawer. The one you were too busy looking inside of to notice." Caroline laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "A dusty envelope? And that led you to believe there was an $8 million loss? Mother, you are delusional." Ellie reached into her handbag and pulled out two things, the small, antique wrought iron key and Arthur's cryptic linen note. She placed them on the mahogany coffee table between them. "This key unlocked a private cabinet in the Harrington Society for Cartography," Ellie explained calmly. "Your father used an alias, A. Finch, to hide his true passion and his most valuable asset, in plain sight, under the guise of an obscure scholarly project. He knew you would never look in a place you considered dusty and irrelevant." Julian snatched the note. He read Arthur's message aloud, his voice growing shaky. "They take the surface. You take the depth. Find the place where the maps overlap and the time stands still. The key fits the lock of the silent witness. Only the archivist knows the path. He looked up, his face etched with horror. What does this mean, Mother? What did you find? I found the truth of your father's last wishes, Ellie said, her composure absolute. Arthur knew you would rush to claim the liquid assets of the main will. He knew your greed would blind you to the condition of the transfer. She then delivered the final, devastating blow. While you were busy chasing a fake $8 million loss in Liechtenstein and fighting over the allocation of the $30 million estate, Miriam Khan, my lawyer, was recording the deed for the Nightingale Preservation Trust in Manhattan. Julian and Caroline stared at her, frozen. The names, Miriam Khan, Nightingale Trust, Manhattan deed, were suddenly, impossibly corporate and real. The Nightingale Trust, Ellie continued, enjoying the cold, strategic precision of the moment, is the sole legal owner of the commercial real estate parcel known as Hudson Towers. The asset is valued at $42 million. Caroline shrieked, an uncontrolled sound of pure entitlement being denied. That's impossible. That land was a corporate asset. It should be part of the estate. It was a corporate asset, Ellie corrected her, leaning forward slightly. But Arthur transferred the deed 3 days before his death, under a clause of irrecoverability. And because you and Julian were named the exclusive beneficiaries of the primary testamentary division, the $30 million, you legally disqualified yourselves from the Nightingale Trust. Julian finally found his voice, a raw whisper of defeat. The default clause. He used our inheritance against us. He made us disqualify ourselves. Ellie picked up the antique key and tucked it back into her pocket. Your father's note said, they take the surface, you take the depth. You took the easy, liquid surface, and now you have the total complexity of Arthur's businesses and all the debt. The irrelevant widow, was left with the depth, a $42 million asset, completely autonomous and legally untouchable by you. You got the money. I got the financial freedom. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the $42 million they had lost through their own fatal flaw, their blind, arrogant assumption that their mother was incapable of finding the truth. The surface had been stripped away, revealing the depths of Arthur's genius and Ellie's newfound, unassailable competence. The aftermath of Ellie's revelation was immediate, brutal, and entirely satisfying. Julian and Caroline did not accept the loss of $42 million with grace. The drawing room, once a scene of quiet, controlled grief, erupted into a maelstrom of denied entitlement and legal panic. Julian, the corporate lawyer, was the first to mobilize, fueled by the sheer terror of losing the largest single asset in the family. He immediately dismissed the fraud claims against the $8 million Phoenix Maritime Holdings and pivoted all his legal resources to challenging the Nightingale Preservation Trust. The deed is invalid. It's a fraudulent transfer intended to circumvent probate. We'll tie this up in litigation for 10 years, Mother. Julian roared, his corporate mask finally shattered, revealing the desperate, grasping man underneath. Caroline, however, realized the depth of the betrayal ran deeper than a legal loophole. He put the key in her hand. Julian. He knew she would find it. This wasn't some legal trick Arthur used on us. This was a personal instruction to her. He was punishing us. Eleanor remained calm, her previous tremor of fear completely replaced by the serene authority of an owner. She simply repeated one line. All future communications must go through my attorney, Miriam Khan. I believe the deed speaks for itself. The next day, Ellie met with Miriam Khan to prepare for the inevitable legal onslaught. Miriam confirmed that Julian's challenge would be aggressive, but ultimately weak. His case relies on proving Arthur was either mentally incapacitated or under duress, which we can easily disprove, Miriam explained. The trust was established years ago, and the final transfer was executed by an international legal team completely separate from the estate. It's a clean partition. They're spending millions to fight a piece of paper Arthur signed just for you. But the legal fight wasn't Ellie's goal. Her goal was autonomy and the complete dismantling of her children's financial superiority, which they had used to justify their cruelty. The $30 million was now Julian and Caroline's shared cage, a volatile mix of illiquid business shares and corporate debt that Arthur had left them to untangle. Ellie held the key to true liquid freedom. "Miriam," Ellie said, laying out the financial pages from Arthur's book of entries. Arthur's ledgers show that Julian's logistics firm, post-transfer, has a revolving line of credit due for renewal in 60 days. That credit line is partially secured by the equity they assumed they had in the Hudson Towers land, which is now my land. Miriam leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her eye. "Now we're talking." The bank extended that credit based on Arthur's corporate portfolio, including that land as a potential collateral boost. The bank knows the land is gone. If the bank sees uncertainty, they will call that line of credit or drastically increase the collateral requirements. This was the opening. Julian and Caroline's $30 million inheritance was a house of cards built on complex, shifting liquidity. Ellie's $42 million, in prime Manhattan land, was rock solid. "I don't want to ruin Julian's business," Ellie mused, "but I want to ensure he is too distracted and financially stretched to continue his legal harassment of me." Miriam developed a plan, subtle, undeniable pressure applied at the exact point of Julian's greatest vulnerability, corporate liquidity. First, Miriam dispatched a quiet letter via an anonymous third-party law firm to the bank holding Julian's logistics firm's line of credit. The letter simply noted the recent, public change in the ownership structure of commercial real estate parcel 49B, Hudson Towers, suggesting that the bank might want to review its collateral assessment. Second, Ellie made the decision to monetize a portion of her new asset. She didn't want the long, drawn-out process of developing the land, but she could use the value of the deed itself. She instructed Miriam to secure a modest, low-interest, non-recourse loan of $5 million against the Nightingale Trust asset. This would provide her with immediate, unrestricted liquidity, something Julian and Caroline had tried to deny her with a meager annuity. "This is not for spending, Miriam," Ellie declared. "This $5 million is my war chest. It is the visible, liquid proof that I don't need their permission, their annuity, or their advice." The impact of Miriam's quiet letter on Julian's banking relationship was immediate. The bank, seeing a potential shortfall in collateral, immediately contacted Julian, demanding fresh, substantial collateral be posted within 30 days to renew the line of credit. Julian was trapped. He needed all the cash from the corporate accounts to shore up the credit line, pulling vital funds away from the already struggling logistics firm. His $12 million inheritance was suddenly illiquid and under siege. Caroline, facing similar pressure from the debt load in her inherited property division, started arguing fiercely with Julian, accusing him of mismanaging the estate's funds. Their alliance, built on shared greed, began to crumble under the weight of Arthur's intricate, debt-heavy legacy. Ellie, watching the chaos unfold from a distance, understood her next move was crucial. The mansion, the symbol of her grief and dependency, had become unbearable. "Miriam, I'm done with the house," Ellie announced. "I want to take a long-term lease on a small, luxury apartment in Manhattan, close to my new asset. I want to be able to physically oversee the Nightingale Trust. I need to be where the money is, managing it myself." This was the most profound decision Ellie had ever made. She was leaving the protective shell of the Hayes mansion, the place where she had existed only as Arthur's wife, and moving into the heart of the financial district, becoming a woman defined by her own capital. She walked through the mansion one last time, ignoring the frantic calls and whispered fights echoing from Julian and Caroline's impromptu war room. She didn't take the antique furniture, the priceless art, or the silver. She took only a few personal items and, symbolically, the dusty book of entries. She left the house to her children, a $15 million liability they could no longer afford to maintain and couldn't easily sell in the middle of their legal chaos. As she stepped into the hired car, leaving the enormous, oppressive structure behind, Ellie felt a lightness she hadn't known in 50 years. She had traded the surface, the beautiful, empty shell of a dependent life, For the depth, $42 million in strategic capital, and the dawning realization of her own sharp, protective intelligence. She wasn't just surviving. She was executing the final, brilliant stroke of Arthur's plan. She was free, financially sovereign, and ready to assume her new identity as the architect of her own future. The move to Manhattan was not just a change of address. It was a psychological declaration of independence. Ellie leased a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the very parcel of land that now constituted her fortune. From her new vantage point, she could literally watch her $42 million asset appreciate. She had shed the skin of the grieving widow and emerged as the formidable owner of the Nightingale Preservation Trust. Miriam Khan, impressed by Ellie's sudden transformation and sharp intuition, had become more than just an attorney. She was now a trusted strategic partner. Ellie, having spent decades absorbing Arthur's business habits through osmosis, quickly adapted to the language of capital management and asset leverage. The pressure exerted on Julian was reaching a boiling point. The bank, alerted to the collateral deficiency, was demanding either an immediate multi-million-dollar deposit or the liquidation of key parts of his logistics firm, the very asset he had fought so hard to inherit. The $12 million inheritance had quickly become a heavy stone chain to his neck. Julian's frantic attempts to prove the Nightingale Trust was a fraudulent gift were easily neutralized by Miriam's airtight documentation. Caroline, facing her own spiraling liabilities from the illiquid property management shares Arthur had bequeathed her, saw Julian's demise as an opportunity. Their alliance, forged in greed, fractured into bitter rivalry. She began subtly undermining Julian's authority within the corporate structure, seeking to position herself as the more stable inheritor to appease the bank. The children, so united in their avarice, were now tearing apart the remnants of the Hayes empire. Ellie, watching the chaos from her new, serene remove, felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. Her goal had never been to bankrupt them, but to make their inheritance reflect the true nature of their characters: complexity, debt, and the heavy burden of real corporate responsibility, without the easy liquidity they had craved. The final element of Arthur's plan began to reveal itself in the pages of the Book of Entries. While the main ledger documented the transfer of the $42 million asset, the last few pages contained a list of Arthur's personal, non-corporate banking accounts Ellie had never known existed. Arthur had maintained 3 secret accounts, labeled simply the contingency funds. Fund Alpha, Education $3 million. Fund Beta, Healthcare $2 million. Fund Gamma, Liquidity $5 million. Totaling $10 million, these funds were held in secure, low-risk instruments and were completely separate from the $30 million estate, which the children took, and the $42 million Nightingale Trust, which Ellie secured. These accounts were named not to Julian or Caroline, but to Arthur's closest friend and financial confidant, Henry Albright, a retired family friend and CPA whom Julian and Caroline had always found boring and dismissed entirely. The Book of Entries contained a new, short note regarding these accounts. Ellie, when they start fighting over the wreckage, contact Henry. He holds the key to the final distribution. The children were never meant to have this $10 million. It is for the future. Ellie realized the full, breathtaking scope of Arthur's genius. He hadn't just secured her future. He had planned for the ethical preservation of the rest of the family's true liquidity, ensuring it bypassed his greedy children entirely. Ellie called Henry Albright immediately. Henry, an honest man who had adored Arthur, confirmed everything. He was the fiduciary guardian of the $10 million in contingency funds, held in blind trusts outside the main will, with one simple directive. Upon Arthur's death, Henry was to wait 6 months, observe the children's behavior, and then release the funds according to the sole instruction of Eleanor Hayes. Arthur predicted exactly what they would do, Ellie, Henry said, his voice grave. He told me, if they show true selfishness, I want Ellie to use this $10 million to rebuild the lives they damaged, not reward their avarice. Ellie now held the power not just to protect herself, but to execute true, moral justice. She instructed Miriam and Henry to work together to execute the final distribution of the $10 million. She made 3 critical decisions for the use of the contingency funds. Fund Alpha, $3 million. Education. Ellie decided to establish a scholarship foundation in Arthur's name dedicated to helping first-generation college students, a cause Arthur had quietly supported throughout his life, completely unknown to Julian or Caroline. This move created positive, public visibility for the Hayes name, but the money was irrevocably gone from the children's grasp. Fund Beta, $2 million. Healthcare. This fund was allocated to fully fund a long-term care policy for Arthur's elderly, financially vulnerable sister, Aunt Margaret, whom Julian and Caroline had effectively ignored for years. This was an act of personal kindness and public rebuke. Fund Gamma, $5 million. Liquidity. This fund was set aside for Ellie's own use, a secondary, highly liquid emergency fund, completely separate from the $5 million loan she had taken out against the $42 million property. This ensured she had absolute, immediate cash on hand for any eventuality, making her financially untouchable. The execution of these transfers, all done quietly, legally, and outside the public probate process, was the final, devastating strategic move. Julian and Caroline, already spending millions on their doomed litigation against the Nightingale Trust and battling their bank, were completely unaware that the liquid $10 million they thought was just unallocated corporate profit had quietly vanished into scholarships and family care policies. The ultimate humiliation was delivered when Julian and Caroline, now desperate for any available cash, finally approached Henry Albright, asking about the unallocated corporate reserves. Henry simply replied, with polite finality, "Those funds were dispersed according to the private, non-testamentary instructions of the late Mr. Hayes. They are now committed to charitable and family support initiatives, managed by the Arthur Hayes Educational Fund and overseen by Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the sole signatory." The realization that their mother, whom they had dismissed as an incompetent, irrelevant widow, was now publicly executing charitable acts in their father's name with money they thought they controlled, while they struggled to save their debt-laden corporate empires, was the final crushing blow. Ellie, watching the news coverage of the new Arthur Hayes Scholarship Fund, knew she had won. Her wisdom, fueled by Arthur's strategic love and her own forced awakening, had secured not just her own freedom, but had used her children's greed to create a legacy of genuine good. She was no longer defined by dependency, but by quiet, powerful competence. Julian's world came crashing down not with a lawsuit, but with a simple, clinical letter from the bank. The bank, seeing the public record of the Nightingale Trust assertion and the disappearance of the Hudson Towers land from the Hayes corporate collateral pool, officially refused to renew the logistics firm's revolving line of credit. The firm, heavily reliant on short-term liquidity, was instantly choked. Julian's $12 million inheritance, the key to his professional dominance, proved to be an illiquid, debt-saddled liability that only Arthur's sheer financial genius had kept afloat. Without the collateral cushion of the $42 million Manhattan land, the firm was over-leveraged and on the brink of receivership. Julian, the corporate lawyer who had demanded his mother's retirement, now faced professional and personal bankruptcy. Caroline, whose own property division shares were proving to be highly volatile and debt-prone, recognized the sinking ship. In a final, desperate act of self-preservation, she broke ranks with her brother. She called Ellie directly, bypassing Miriam Khan, and dropped the pretense of sympathy. "Mother, I'm willing to concede the Nightingale Trust to you. I will sign any document today affirming your sole, irrevocable ownership," Caroline pleaded, her voice thin with anxiety. "But you must use a portion of the Nightingale capital, just a small loan, to stabilize the property division. I can't lose everything because of Julian's incompetence." Ellie listened unmoved. Caroline was still operating on the surface, believing that money could buy her way out of consequences. "Caroline," Ellie replied, her voice calm and authoritative, "the Nightingale Trust is not a family bailout fund. It is legally sequestered capital. As for the property division, I suggest you consult with Julian and come to my lawyer's office tomorrow morning, together." You will drop the Nightingale lawsuit completely, or Miriam Khan will be authorized to proceed with a full legal review of your inherited assets. The threat was clear. The review would expose the true depth of debt in Caroline's portfolio, ruining her as surely as Julian was ruined. She had no choice but to comply. The final meeting took place in Miriam Khan's pristine, high-rise office, a room that symbolized the uncompromising power of competence. Julian and Caroline arrived looking haggard and defeated. Julian, once so confident, couldn't meet Ellie's gaze. "We have prepared a single document," Miriam announced, placing a folder on the glass table. "It is a mutual release affirming that the Nightingale Preservation Trust is beyond the scope of the Hayes estate, thereby dropping all claims of fraudulent transfer. You sign this, and Mrs. Hayes agrees to bear her own substantial legal costs, rather than pursuing yours." In essence, Ellie was offering a $2 million reprieve on legal fees, a lifeline Julian desperately needed to pay his own team. It was the only way he could legally save face and cut his losses. Julian signed first, his hand shaking slightly as he relinquished his claim on the $42 million asset. Caroline signed immediately after, looking venomously at her brother, blaming him for their collective downfall. When the papers were executed, Miriam gathered them quickly. "The matter is closed. Mrs. Hayes, they are your children. Would you like a moment?" Ellie nodded, and Miriam stepped out, leaving the three of them alone in the quiet, sterile room. Julian finally looked up at his mother, his expression a mixture of profound bitterness and genuine, raw confusion. "Why, Mother? Why the elaborate deception?" Julian demanded. "You could have just told us. You could have left us a note saying you had the land." "Because you wouldn't have believed me, Julian," Ellie said softly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You would have only believed a financial instrument signed by Arthur. And you would have fought me just as hard, convinced that I was too incompetent to manage such a large asset." She pulled out the original linen note, the one that had been hidden in the dusty envelope, and smoothed it on the table. "This note wasn't just a map to the asset, children. It was a mirror for your father's final judgment of you. You chased the $30 million without a single thought for your mother's security. You dismissed the one person your father intended to protect." Ellie paused, then delivered the final, non-financial bequest, the true contents of the dusty envelope they had missed. "Arthur left you one final thing that was truly yours, something separate from the $30 million you took, the $42 million I acquired, and the $10 million that went to charity." Julian and Caroline leaned forward, desperate for some final, non-debt-related inheritance. Ellie pointed to the last line of the note, Arthur's farewell. "With eternal love, Arthur." That line, Ellie said, her voice firm, was all Arthur left you that wasn't tied to debt, liability, or condition. Everything else was a test of character that you both failed. He secured my financial independence, and in doing so, he made your $30 million inheritance exactly what it was always intended to be, a liquid corporate burden, unredeemed by any sense of moral obligation. She stood up, looking at her children not with malice, but with a cold, clear finality. She was no longer their mother in the traditional sense. She was a sovereign power who had just signed a peace treaty with two lesser states. The assets are now defined. I have my future. You have the complexity of the past. I hope you learn to manage it without recourse to greed. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the office, leaving Julian and Caroline staring at the small, dusty note and the single, hollow phrase of love that stood in stark contrast to the millions they had fought over. Ellie had won, not by taking their money, but by forcing them to confront the true, damning nature of what they had valued, and what they had lost. The next 6 months established the new reality with brutal finality. Eleanor Ellie Hayes was no longer the irrelevant widow. She was the architect of her own autonomy, living a life defined by freedom and purpose. From her Manhattan apartment, Ellie, guided by Miriam Khan, actively managed the $42 million Nightingale Preservation Trust. She immersed herself in the details, learning the intricacies of real estate law, zoning, and portfolio management. Her decades of managing a complex household, demanding precision and organization, finally found a professional application. She was focused, decisive, and quietly respected by her legal and financial team. Miriam had even nominated her for a local board focused on cultural preservation, an echo of Arthur's passion for the obscure, which Ellie now embraced. The mansion, the symbol of her old, dependent life, was successfully sold by Julian and Caroline at a staggering loss. They had been forced to liquidate quickly to cover outstanding corporate liabilities and legal fees, ensuring they received almost nothing from the physical structure itself. The magnificent cage was gone, and with it, the last tie to Arthur's public legacy. Julian's logistics firm, choked by the non-renewal of the credit line, spiraled into restructuring. His reputation as a high-flyer was permanently tainted by the public disclosure of his firm's massive leverage and subsequent failure. He was forced to sell off the majority stake, retaining only a small, marginalized division. He lost the Miami penthouse and now works as a mid-level consultant, his entire inheritance reduced to a fraction of its original value, consumed by debt and desperation. Caroline's fate was quieter, but equally severe. She could not sustain the debt load on the property management portfolio. She had to sell the Martha's Vineyard estate and liquidate her shares at a steep discount to avoid total bankruptcy. She blamed Julian entirely, and their once united front of avarice dissolved into mutual recrimination. They rarely spoke, the massive inheritance having served as the ultimate wedge, achieving the exact opposite of the financial unity they had anticipated. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ellie met Henry Albright, Arthur's trusted confidant, for lunch overlooking the Hudson River. Henry confirmed the success of the contingency funds. The Arthur Hayes Educational Fund was fully functional, and Aunt Margaret was happily settled into her funded long-term care facility. "Arthur would be so proud, Ellie," Henry said, smiling genuinely. "He always knew you had the grit, but he worried you never had the motivation to use it. That envelope, that whole charade, it wasn't just insurance against the children's greed. It was his final, forced lesson in autonomy for you." Ellie nodded, reflecting on the wound to wisdom transformation. The initial wound, the shock of her husband's perceived abandonment, followed by her children's ruthless betrayal, had been profound. She had gone from being a woman paralyzed by dependence to one defined by an absolute refusal to be dismissed. "He didn't just leave me $42 million, Henry," Ellie stated, her voice quiet but strong. "He left me a roadmap out of my own irrelevance. He forced me to use the tools I already possessed, patience, organization, and attention to detail, to solve a puzzle that Julian and Caroline were too arrogant to even see. He gave them a gift that required ruthlessness, and he gave me a gift that required competence." As she finished her thought, she pulled out the very object that had started the entire journey, the original, dusty manila envelope. It was empty now, save for the old, brittle wax seal. "I kept this," she explained, holding the rough paper between her fingers. "It represents the moment I realized the surface was a lie. It was the point of separation between who I was and who I became." She stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace overlooking the river, where the wind was brisk and clean. With a decisive movement, she opened her hand and dropped the envelope. The wind immediately caught the flimsy paper, lifting it high above the water, carrying it away rapidly, a small, insignificant piece of dust vanishing into the wide, indifferent expanse of the sky. It was a final, symbolic release. The wound was gone, the mystery was solved, and the dependency was severed. Ellie was no longer reacting to Arthur's death or her children's greed. She was simply managing her own life. She returned to the table, her face radiating peace. She had been left with nothing but a dusty envelope, and that envelope had led her to everything: financial security, strategic wisdom, and the profound, unassailable confidence that she was, and always had been, fully relevant. The story of the irrelevant wife who found $42 million was over. The story of Eleanor Hayes, the powerful, autonomous woman, had just begun. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Voice of Jenna so you never miss the next chapter in our world of twists, lessons, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world to me, and trust me, the stories only get better from here.